The scream that pierced through Memorial Hospital's maternity ward at 2:47 a.m. wasn't from a woman in labor. It came from Dr. Monique Hayes, as two uniformed officers dragged her away from the operating table, where her sister lay split open, bleeding, and fighting for two lives. "Get your hands off me!" Her voice cracked against the sterile walls as latex gloves snapped from her fingers, leaving bloody prints on the white uniforms of the men who called her an intruder in her own domain. 12 hours earlier, Monique had been reviewing charts in her office on the 7th floor. The brass nameplate reading Dr. M. Hayes, Chief of Obstetrics, catching the afternoon light that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. "Mo, my water broke." The voice belonged to Angela, her younger sister, breathless and scared. "The baby's not due for 3 weeks." 23 minutes later, Monique stood in the emergency entrance, her Louboutin heels clicking against polished linoleum as she followed the gurney carrying Angela through sliding doors that whispered shut behind them. Angela's face, normally the color of warm caramel, had turned ashen. Her vitals displayed on the monitor painted a picture that made Monique's medical training kick into overdrive, even as her sister's hand squeezed hers with desperate strength. Preeclampsia. Dr. Richards confirmed what Monique had already diagnosed from the readings. "We need to deliver now. The baby's in distress, and her blood pressure is spiking." Angela's eyes found Monique's face. "Don't leave me." The words came out as a whisper, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of shared secrets, scraped knees, and promises kept. Monique scrubbed in with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. The bristles scraped against her skin as she counted the required minutes, watching through the observation window as the surgical team prepared Angela for the emergency C-section. Steam rose from the sink as hot water cascaded over her forearms, washing away the day's accumulation of decisions, consultations, and the weight of other people's lives held in her hands. She backed through the door into the operating room, arms raised, water dripping from her elbows. The familiar dance of surgery began around her as she took her position beside Angela's head. "I'm here," she whispered to her sister, whose eyes were wide with fear above the oxygen mask. The anesthesiologist nodded his readiness. "Doctor." Richards made the first incision. That's when the doors burst open. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the patient." The voice belonged to Officer Martinez, whose bulk filled the doorway as he surveyed the scene with the suspicious eyes of someone looking for trouble. Behind him, Officer Chen shifted nervously, his hand resting on his radio. "We received a report of someone impersonating medical staff." The operating room fell silent, except for the steady beep of Angela's heart monitor and the hiss of the ventilator. "Doctor?" Richards looked up from the incision, his brow furrowed above his surgical mask. "Officers, this is Dr. Hayes. She's the head of this department." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I don't see any identification," Martinez replied, his gaze fixed on Monique with the intensity of a predator who had found his prey. "And our caller was very specific about a black woman pretending to be a doctor." The words hung in the air like a toxic gas, poisoning everything they touched. Monique's hands, steady through countless surgeries, began to tremble. "My ID is in my locker. I'm Dr. Monique Hayes, and this is my sister. Please, she's having complications." Her voice maintained its professional calm, but underneath ran a current of something that sounded dangerously close to pleading. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step away from the patient and come with us." Chen's voice was softer than his partner's, but no less insistent. "We can sort this out, but right now, You're interfering with hospital operations." Angela's blood pressure alarm began to wail. The sound cut through the room like a siren, demanding immediate attention. On the monitor, numbers flashed red as her condition deteriorated. "She's crashing, Doctor," Richards announced, his hands moving quickly to control the bleeding that had suddenly increased. "I need everyone focused here." "Officers, please." Monique stepped closer to Angela, whose eyes had found hers with desperate recognition. "Let me do my job. People are going to die." Martinez moved with surprising speed for such a large man. His hands closed around Monique's upper arms, pulling her away from the table with enough force to make her stumble. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for trespassing and impersonating a medical professional." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room as her wrists were secured behind her back. The last thing Monique saw as they dragged her from the operating room was Angela's face, pale and terrified, as the surgical team worked frantically to save both her and her baby. The door swung shut with finality, cutting off her view of a scene that would replay in her nightmares for months to come. In the hallway, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects as Monique found herself pressed against the wall, the handcuffs cutting into her wrists. Around them, hospital staff moved with purpose, some stopping to stare at the unusual sight of a doctor in custody. "Dr. Patricia Williams from Pediatrics approached cautiously, her face a mask of confusion and concern. "Monique, what's happening here?" "Doctor." Williams addressed the officers directly. "This is Dr. Hayes. She runs the OB department." "Ma'am, we have a report of impersonation," Chen replied, consulting his notebook with bureaucratic precision. The caller was very specific about the suspect's description and behavior. Through the observation window, they could see the chaos unfolding in the operating room. Angela's vitals continued to deteriorate as Dr. Richards worked to stabilize both mother and child. The baby's heart rate, displayed on a separate monitor, showed the dangerous pattern of fetal distress that meant seconds mattered more than minutes. "My sister is dying in there." Monique's voice cracked as she watched the medical team fight to save 2 lives. "Please, call Dr. Morrison. Call anyone. Just verify who I am and let me help her." Martinez consulted his radio, speaking in codes that meant nothing to the medical staff gathering in the hallway, but everything to the uniformed men who had become the arbiters of who belonged where. The response crackled through static, unintelligible to civilian ears, but clear enough in its denial of immediate assistance. 15 minutes passed. In obstetrics, 15 minutes could mean the difference between a healthy delivery and tragedy that haunted families forever. Through the window, they watched as Dr. Richards successfully delivered Angela's baby. A tiny form that wasn't moving, wasn't crying, wasn't showing the immediate signs of life that everyone in that room desperately needed to see. The neonatal team rushed in with equipment that looked more suited to a space mission than a delivery room: tubes, monitors, and devices whose names Monique knew by heart but couldn't help apply. Her expertise, her knowledge, her ability to guide the team through protocols she had helped develop, remained locked behind handcuffs and the institutional racism that had branded her as an imposter in her own hospital. "The baby needs to go to NICU immediately," Dr. Williams announced, reading the situation through the window with the trained eye of someone who had seen too many emergencies. "Monique, what's the protocol for extreme prematurity with suspected respiratory distress?" "Immediate intubation, surfactant therapy, and continuous monitoring," Monique replied automatically, her medical training overriding the surreal circumstances of providing consultation while in custody. "But they need to check for patent ductus arteriosus and be prepared for emergency surgery if..." "Ma'am, You need to stop giving medical advice. Martinez interrupted. You're not qualified to be making those kinds of statements. The absurdity of the situation hit everyone in the hallway at the same moment. Here stood one of the most respected obstetricians in the state, handcuffed and prevented from helping save her own nephew's life by officers who had responded to an anonymous tip that had turned their world upside down. Dr. Williams pulled out her phone, dialing with shaking fingers. Dr. Morrison, we have a situation in maternity. Yes, sir. Monique is being arrested. No, sir. I'm not joking. Her voice carried down the hallway, bouncing off walls that had witnessed thousands of births, deaths, and miracles. But nothing quite like this. As they waited for some semblance of sanity to arrive, the baby was wheeled past them toward the NICU, a tiny form surrounded by medical equipment and the urgent whispers of specialists who knew that the next few hours would determine whether this child would grow up to ask questions about the night of his birth. Angela followed on a separate gurney, her face gray with blood loss and the sedation that followed emergency surgery. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us to the station, Chen announced, consulting his watch with the casual indifference of someone whose shift was nearly over. We can process your paperwork there and get this sorted out. You're taking her away from the hospital. Dr. Williams stepped forward, her slight frame suddenly seeming much larger. Her nephew is fighting for his life. Her sister just underwent emergency surgery. And you want to take the person who could help them the most to jail. The elevator chimed, and Dr. Robert Morrison emerged like an avenging angel in scrubs. At 62, the chief of surgery commanded respect through sheer presence and a reputation built over decades of saving lives that others had written off as lost causes. His gray hair was disheveled, his surgical mask hanging loose around his neck, and his face displayed the kind of fury that made residents reconsider their career choices. What in God's name is happening here? His voice carried the authority of someone who had just left a successful 12-hour surgery to find his hospital in chaos. His eyes took in the scene: Monique in handcuffs, officers blocking access to the NICU, and medical staff standing around like extras in a movie they didn't understand. Sir, we're responding to a report of impersonation, Martinez began. But Morrison cut him off with a gesture that could have stopped traffic. Impersonation. This is Dr. Monique Hayes. She's the head of obstetrics. She's delivered over 3,000 babies in this hospital, and she's probably forgotten more about medicine than you'll ever learn. His voice rose with each word until it echoed through the hallway like thunder. And you have her in handcuffs because someone called in a complaint. The officers exchanged glances that spoke of procedures, protocols, and the uncomfortable realization that they might have made a mistake of epic proportions. But procedures were procedures, and backing down would mean admitting that they had arrested one of the city's most prominent physicians based on nothing more than an anonymous tip rooted in prejudice. Sir, we still need to verify her identity through proper channels, Chen replied, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. And we need to investigate the complaint that was filed. Morrison pulled out his phone with the deliberate motion of someone about to change the course of events. Margaret, it's Bob Morrison. I need you to conference in the hospital board, the chief of police, and our legal department. Now. He paused, his eyes never leaving the officers. Because 2 of your officers just arrested the head of my obstetrics department while she was trying to save her nephew's life. The phone call that followed would be discussed in medical and legal circles for years to come. As Dr. Morrison spoke with calm precision about liability, malpractice, and the potential consequences of preventing a qualified physician from providing emergency care, the officers began to understand that they had stumbled into something much larger than a simple trespassing case. Within minutes, the hallway filled with administrators, lawyers, and hospital security personnel who looked like they had been pulled from their beds and told that the institution's future hung in the balance. Chief of Police Janet Rodriguez arrived with the expression of someone who had just learned that her officers had potentially created a legal and public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions. "Uncuff her, now!" Rodriguez's words carried the weight of 25 years in law enforcement and the political instincts of someone who knew when to cut losses before they became career-ending disasters. "Officers, you're off this case. Report to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow morning." As the handcuffs came off, Monique rubbed her wrists where the metal had left angry red marks. The feeling of circulation returning to her hands was nothing compared to the relief of being able to move freely again. But the damage had been done. Her nephew had spent crucial minutes without the expertise that might have made the difference between normal development and lifelong challenges. "How is he?" she asked Dr. Williams, who had been monitoring the NICU situation through calls and updates from the nursing staff. "Stable, but critical. He's on a ventilator, and they're monitoring for bleeding in the brain. Dr. Patterson is handling the case, but he's asking for your consultation." Dr. Williams paused, her hand finding Monique's shoulder. "Angela is stable too. She lost a lot of blood, but she's responding well to transfusion." Monique closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the last hour settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her sister and nephew were alive, but the trauma of what had happened would ripple through their family for generations. More importantly, other families might face similar situations if the systemic problems that had led to tonight's events weren't addressed. "Doctor," Morrison approached, his earlier fury replaced by the calculating look of someone planning a response that would prevent future occurrences. "Monique, I'm sorry. This should never have happened, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." "Who called it in?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would reveal a pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond tonight's incident. "We're investigating, but the call came from someone claiming to be a hospital employee who saw suspicious activity in the maternity ward." Morrison's voice carried the disgust of someone who had spent his career believing that medicine transcended the petty prejudices that plagued other professions. "The caller specifically mentioned your race and claimed you were acting aggressive toward staff." The description felt like a physical blow. Throughout her career, Monique had been described as aggressive for displaying the same confidence and assertiveness that were praised in her male colleagues. Tonight, that characterization had nearly cost her nephew his life and her sister her peace of mind during the most vulnerable moment a woman could experience. Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, her expression grim. "Dr. Hayes, I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. My officers responded to a call, but they should have verified the situation before taking action. We're going to conduct a full investigation, and there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Monique's voice was steady, but underneath ran the steel of someone who had spent years fighting battles that shouldn't have needed to be fought. "Because if this was just a misunderstanding, then tomorrow night another doctor who looks like me might find herself in handcuffs while her patient dies." The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was far from extinguished. Around them, hospital staff continued their work, but the whispers and glances revealed that word of the incident was spreading through the building like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Margaret Chen, the hospital's legal counsel, arrived with a briefcase and the expression of someone who had been woken up to handle a crisis that could define her career. Behind her came board members, insurance representatives, and various officials whose presence transformed the hallway into an impromptu command center for damage control. Dr. Hayes, Margaret began, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who knew that every word would be scrutinized later. The hospital board has called an emergency meeting. We want to address this situation immediately and ensure that appropriate measures are taken. The meeting that followed would become the subject of case studies in medical ethics and hospital administration programs across the country, as board members connected via video conference from their homes, their faces on laptop screens creating a digital jury. The full scope of what had happened began to emerge. The anonymous caller had indeed been a hospital employee, a security guard named Derek Hampton, who had been reprimanded twice for inappropriate comments about minority staff members. His call to police had been motivated not by genuine concern for hospital security, but by his discomfort with seeing a black woman in a position of authority in what he considered his domain. More disturbing were the revelations that emerged from the investigation that followed. Hampton had made similar calls about other minority staff members, though none had resulted in arrests. His reports consistently described qualified professionals as suspicious or acting aggressively when they were simply doing their jobs with the competence and confidence that had earned them their positions. The insurance implications alone were staggering. The hospital's malpractice carrier had been notified of the incident and was already calculating the potential liability of preventing a qualified physician from providing emergency care. The numbers being discussed in hushed conversations between lawyers made it clear that this wasn't just a matter of individual justice, but institutional survival. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital windows with pink and gold light, the emergency board meeting concluded with decisions that would reshape Memorial Hospital's policies forever. Derek Hampton was terminated immediately, with a notation in his file that would prevent him from working in healthcare again. The officers involved were suspended pending investigation, and new protocols were implemented requiring verification of staff credentials before any law enforcement action could be taken on hospital property. But for Monique, standing in the NICU watching her nephew fight for each breath through machines that hummed and beeped with mechanical precision, the policy changes felt like a bandage on a wound that ran much deeper than any single incident. Her nephew's tiny fingers, no bigger than matchsticks, wrapped around her pinky with surprising strength, but she couldn't shake the knowledge that his first hours of life had been compromised by hatred, masquerading as concern. Angela woke up in recovery, asking for her baby, her sister, and an explanation for the chaos she remembered through the haze of anesthesia and blood loss. Monique sat beside her bed, holding her hand and trying to find words that could make sense of a night that had tested everything she believed about progress, justice, and the profession she had devoted her life to serving. "He's beautiful," Monique whispered, showing Angela photos of their nephew on her phone. "He's a fighter, just like his mother." "What happened?" "Mo, I remember voices, shouting. And then you were gone." Angela's voice was weak, but her eyes held the clarity of someone who needed truth more than comfort. The story that Monique told, sitting in that recovery room as morning shift nurses began their rounds and the hospital settled into the rhythm of a new day, was one of systemic problems that had been hiding behind professional courtesy and institutional politeness. It was a story that would need to be told publicly if real change was going to happen. The press conference was Dr. Morrison's idea, but Monique's decision to participate was driven by a responsibility that extended far beyond her own experience. Standing behind a podium in the hospital's main lobby, facing cameras and reporters who had gathered to hear about an incident that had already gone viral on social media, she spoke with the calm authority that had made her one of the most respected physicians in the region. "Last night, I was prevented from providing emergency medical care to my sister and nephew by police officers who responded to a racially motivated complaint," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the marble-floored lobby that had welcomed thousands of families during their most vulnerable moments. This wasn't just an attack on me personally. It was an attack on every patient who depends on qualified medical professionals to provide care, without regard to race, gender, or any other factor irrelevant to medical expertise. The questions that followed revealed the hunger for a story that went beyond simple misconduct to touch on deeper issues of institutional racism in healthcare. When asked about her plans for legal action, Monique's response surprised everyone, including the lawyers who had been preparing for months of litigation. "I'm not interested in personal compensation," she said, her eyes finding the cameras that would carry her words to viewers across the country. "I'm interested in ensuring that no other medical professional faces what I faced last night, and that no patient suffers because qualified care is prevented by prejudice." The solution that emerged from negotiations between the hospital, the city, and community representatives was as unprecedented as the incident that had sparked it. Rather than pursuing individual legal remedies, Monique proposed the creation of a fund dedicated to addressing racial disparities in maternal health care, an initiative that would bear her family's name and serve as a living memorial to a night when everything went wrong, but ultimately led to something better. The Hayes Family Maternal Health Center opened 18 months later in a new wing of Memorial Hospital. Funded by contributions from the hospital system, the city's settlement with the affected parties, and donations from across the country, the center provided specialized care for high-risk pregnancies, with particular attention to the racial disparities that made Black women 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than their white counterparts. On opening day, Monique stood in the lobby of the new center, watching as families from across the community came to see what had been built from the ashes of one terrible night. Her nephew, now a healthy toddler with his mother's eyes and his aunt's determination, played at her feet while Angela spoke to reporters about the importance of having medical professionals who understood both the clinical and cultural aspects of caring for diverse populations. Derek Hampton had been arrested that morning, charged with filing false police reports and interfering with medical care. The charges were largely symbolic, but they sent a message that institutional racism would face consequences, not just policy changes and sensitivity training. The officers involved had been terminated and were facing civil rights violations charges that would likely end their law enforcement careers. But, for Monique, the real victory wasn't in the punishments meted out to those who had wronged her. It was in the teenage girl who approached her after the opening ceremony, a young Black woman who introduced herself as a pre-med student at the local university. "Dr. Hayes, I read about what happened to you, and I almost changed my major," the girl said, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone still finding her way in the world. "I thought maybe medicine wasn't ready for people like us." Monique looked at the girl, seeing in her face the echoes of her own journey through medical school, residency, and the countless small battles that had led her to this moment. "Medicine needs people like us," she replied. "It needs our perspectives, our experiences, and our commitment to serving everyone who walks through these doors." As the day wound down and the last visitors left the new center, Monique walked through the halls that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Each room was equipped with the latest technology, but more importantly, each was staffed with professionals who had been trained not just in medical procedures, but in the cultural competency that could mean the difference between life and death for patients whose experiences didn't match textbook assumptions. The center's first patient arrived that evening, a young Latina woman whose pregnancy complications had been dismissed at another hospital as normal anxiety. Within hours of her arrival, Monique's team had diagnosed preeclampsia and begun treatment that would save both mother and child. It was exactly the kind of case that the center had been designed to handle, and its successful resolution felt like a promise kept to everyone who had supported the vision that emerged from tragedy. Later that night, as Monique sat in her office reviewing charts for the following day's patients, she received a call from Dr. Morrison. The old surgeon's voice carried excitement that she hadn't heard since the night everything changed. "Monique, I just got off the phone with the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. They want to use the Hayes Center as a model for addressing racial disparities in maternal care nationwide. They're talking about funding similar centers in 50 cities across the country." The magnitude of what had grown from one night of injustice was almost overwhelming. From handcuffs and accusations of impersonation had come a movement that would touch the lives of thousands of women and children who might otherwise have been overlooked by a healthcare system that too often reflected the biases of the society it served. As she drove home that night, passing the hospital where her journey had begun with shrieks and struggle, Monique reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed personal trauma into public good. Her nephew slept peacefully in his car seat, his breathing steady and strong, a living reminder that the most profound victories often came from the darkest moments. The final chapter of the story was still being written in examination rooms and delivery suites across the country, where women who looked like her sister could receive care from professionals who understood that medical expertise wore many faces and spoke with many voices. It was being written in medical schools where students learned that cultural competency was as important as clinical knowledge, and in hospitals where policies ensured that qualified professionals could practice their calling without interference from prejudice, masquerading as procedure. But perhaps most importantly, it was being written in the hearts and minds of young people who saw in Monique's story not a cautionary tale about the persistence of racism, but a blueprint for how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. The girl who had approached her at the opening ceremony would graduate from medical school in 4 years, inspired by the knowledge that medicine was indeed ready for people like them, and that their presence would make it better for everyone who followed.